My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 67 years old. After 42 years working in emergency rooms filled with noise and fluorescent light, I thought I understood silence. I was wrong. Real silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of stillness. Out here, near Bryson City, the kind of quiet I found could almost breathe. The cabin sat at the edge of a ridge overlooking the Smoky Mountains, its porch wrapped around like a steady arm. When I turned the key that first morning, the air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth, and I knew this was the peace I had earned. I unpacked slowly, one box at a time. The walls were warm cedar, the kind of wood that kept its scent no matter how many years passed. My husband, Ray, had once talked about retiring to the mountains before the cancer took him. I kept his fishing hat on a nail by the door. It was my way of keeping him here, not haunting, just remembering. The days began to take on their own rhythm. Mornings with coffee and the mist rolling down the hills. Afternoons reading old nursing journals I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Evenings with a single lamp glowing and the sound of the river whispering below. For the first time since Ray's passing, my pulse felt steady again. It was late afternoon when the peace broke. I was making soup potatoes, leeks, and the last of the carrots from the farmer's market when the landline rang. The sound startled me. No one had the number except my son. "Mark, Mom," came the voice, but it wasn't Mark. It was Chelsea, his wife. Her tone carried that brightness people use when they've already made a decision. "We've been thinking," she said. "It makes sense for my parents to move in with you for a while. You've got all that space, and they need somewhere peaceful." I turned off the stove, wiping my hands on a towel. "Move in," I repeated, keeping my voice calm. "Yes," she said lightly, "just until they get settled. You won't mind, will you? It's only fair. You're by yourself now." Fair. I looked out the kitchen window, where fog was beginning to rise between the trees. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, one barely large enough for a single bed. I had built my peace one wall at a time, and now someone miles away was rearranging it over the phone. "I'll need to talk to Mark," I said. She hesitated. "He's right here," she added. Then the faint sound of his voice muffled, uncertain, reached me. They spoke quietly on the other end, and then she returned. "Anyway, it's settled. They'll come next month." The line went dead. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the windows. I stood there, the spoon still in my hand, the smell of soup thick in the air. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful anymore. It was listening. The next morning began like any other. Mist rolled down from the ridgeline and settled against the windows. I made my coffee the same way I always did, half cream, a pinch of cinnamon. The habit Ray used to tease me about. I tried to let the morning light smooth out what the call from Chelsea had stirred, but the air felt strange, unsettled. The phone rang again just after 9. For a moment, I thought about letting it go to voicemail, but habit and a mother's instinct won. "Morning, Mom," Mark said. His voice carried that polite tone he used when he didn't want to start a fight. "Chelsea told me she spoke with you." "She did," I said. It was a surprise. There was a pause long enough for a heartbeat. "It's just temporary," he said finally. "Her parents lost their apartment, and the lease is up. You have extra space, and you're alone out there. It makes sense." Sense for whom he exhaled. And I could picture him rubbing the bridge of his nose the way he always did when I challenged him. "Mom, don't start. It's just until they get back on their feet." "Mark," I said carefully, "this cabin isn't a boarding house. It's my home. Your home has 2 bedrooms, he reminded me, like a realtor pitching a sale, and they're family now. You know how much they've helped us over the years." I thought about the word helped. Chelsea's parents, Harold and Susan, had offered them the down payment for their new townhouse in Charlotte. I knew the story well. It had been repeated at every family gathering as if generosity erased entitlement. "Why don't they stay with you?" I asked. His tone hardened just a little. "You know we don't have room, and Chelsea's been under so much stress. It would mean a lot if you could make this easy." There it was, the gentle guilt, wrapped like ribbon around command. He didn't raise his voice, but the silence that followed pressed harder than any argument. "I'll think about it," I said at last. "Good." He answered too quickly, relief spilling through the line. "They're planning to come next month. I'll help them move in." When the call ended, I stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the slope of the woods. The cabin was small, but every inch carried memory. The rocking chair on the porch where Ray used to drink his evening beer. The framed photograph of my first nursing team, all of us grinning despite exhaustion. This place was built for quiet, not company. Still, I spent the next days pretending I wasn't worried. I cleaned, organized drawers, sorted old linens as if hospitality might come naturally once the anger faded. But it didn't fade, it settled deeper. A week later, I drove into town for supplies. The man at the hardware store, Tom, nodded when I asked about new locks. "Coyotes," he joked. "Something like that." I said, "But at the grocery." I ran into Martha from church back in Asheville. She hugged me too tightly and said, "Heard you're not alone up there much longer. The rumor had already spread." That night, I called Mark again. "You told people they're moving in. I didn't think it was a secret." He said, "Chelsea's parents are excited." "Excited," I repeated. "About moving into someone else's home." He hesitated. "Their family." "Stop making it sound so dramatic." "I'm asking for respect," I said quietly. "That's not drama." There was a silence that stretched thin and sharp. Then, without warning, a new voice came through. "Chelsea, Eleanor," she said brightly. "Mark's terrible at explaining things. I just wanted to clear it up. My parents will live with you. If you don't like it, move back to the city. We'll take care of the house." The line stayed open, but I couldn't speak. My son said nothing. I could hear him breathing on the other end, steady, uneasy. When the call finally ended, I set the phone down and sat by the window until the sky turned dark. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called once and went silent. The stillness didn't comfort me anymore. It felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. 3 days later, Mark called and said he wanted to come up for the weekend. He used the same calm tone he always did when something was already decided. "Just to check the place out. Mom," he said, "maybe help you with a few things." By Saturday morning, the driveway was filled with the sound of tires on gravel. His car looked out of place against the trees, too polished, too loud for this quiet world. I watched from the porch as he stepped out, carrying a brown envelope under one arm and a bag of groceries in the other. Still the same coffee brand he asked, setting the bag on the counter. He looked around the cabin as though taking inventory. Nice place. Smaller than I imagined. I poured 2 cups of coffee and waited. The silence between us was familiar, the kind that comes when both sides already know what's coming next. He cleared his throat. "Chelsea's parents are really grateful. You know, they'll keep to themselves. And Susan's good with gardens. She could help with the yard. I like the yard the way it is." I said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've got a lot of space here, Mom. They just need somewhere safe for a few months. Think of it as helping family." I let him talk while I stirred my coffee. I had spent my whole life tending to others, reading their words the way I once read vital signs. His pulse was quick beneath the calm, his voice too smooth. Something was off. Finally, he reached for the envelope. "Chelsea found a form online," he said lightly. "It's just paperwork to make sure their mail can be delivered here. I figured we'd get ahead of things." He slid the papers across the table. They looked official county seal, legal language, all printed neatly. Temporary residency. The heading read, my name was already written in ink at the top, waiting for a signature. Where did you get this? I asked. It's nothing complicated, he said. Just formality. You sign it. They can handle utilities, help pay bills. Less stress for you. I looked up. You mean control the house? He laughed too quickly. No, of course not. Mom, you're being suspicious for no reason. The years between us, decades of scraped knees, school plays, and phone calls during night shifts stood like a wall in the room. I had never once refused him anything he truly wanted. Until now. I folded the papers carefully and slid them back toward him. I'll have my lawyer look at it, I said. He frowned. You have a lawyer? Yes, I said simply. Everyone should. His jaw tightened. And for the first time, I saw the fear behind his frustration. He gathered the papers and stood. Chelsea will be disappointed, he said. We thought you'd be more understanding. I am, I answered softly. That's why I'm saying no before anyone gets hurt. He didn't hug me when he left. The sound of his car faded down the road, swallowed by the trees. I stood on the porch until the gravel settled back into stillness. The afternoon light shifted across the mountains, pale and thin. I walked back inside and locked the door, a small, quiet motion that felt heavier than it should have. The line had been crossed, and for the first time, I understood it would not be the last. The first snow came early that year, soft flakes drifting across the porch railings like ash. I spent the morning splitting kindling and humming an old hymn under my breath, letting the rhythm of the axe drown out the thoughts that kept circling back to Mark. He hadn't called since that day with the papers. Part of me hoped the silence meant he'd come to his senses. But silence, I was learning, could hide more than words ever could. That afternoon, while picking up supplies in town, I stopped at the local cafe, a narrow place tucked beside the bank. The owner, Margaret, waved me over. She had the kind of easy kindness mountain towns are built on. Eleanor, you still getting used to our winters? She asked, pouring coffee before I could answer. Trying to, I said with a smile. Every year feels a little longer. Before she could respond, a man stepped up to pay his bill at the counter, someone I recognized from church the previous Sunday. His name was Paul Winters, assistant manager at the local bank. He nodded politely. You're Mark Vance's mother. Right, I hesitated, wary of his tone. Yes, that's right. He sighed lightly, as if realizing he'd said too much already. Good man. Your son. Tough market lately. Though, everyone's feeling it. Heard his firm's restructuring. Restructuring, I repeated. He looked uncomfortable, glancing at Margaret before lowering his voice. I probably shouldn't say much, but when mortgage accounts get flagged, things tend to reach us sooner or later. Charlotte's been rough on small financial offices this year. I kept my expression neutral, even as my stomach tightened. I see. Thank you, Mr. Winters. He nodded, realizing he'd overstepped, and left with a polite smile. Margaret refilled my cup without a word. The drive back to the cabin blurred past in a haze of cold light and sharp thoughts. The pieces began to fit together in ways I hadn't wanted to see. Mark's eagerness to help, Chelsea's sudden insistence that her parents move in, the push for paperwork that would shift authority. It wasn't about family at all. It was about money. By the time I reached home, the snow had stopped, leaving a white stillness across the yard. I stood on the porch, the cold biting through my gloves, and let the truth settle like frost on glass. My son was in trouble, and he was reaching for the one thing left that was still mine. Inside, I lit the fire and sat at the table where he'd placed the papers days earlier. The grain of the wood was worn smooth under my hand, the same hand that had bandaged strangers. held dying patients, and once carried him through fevers and fear. I had saved lives my whole career, but this time, I would have to save something far more fragile, my peace. The drive to Asheville took nearly 2 hours, winding through the smoky foothills where the fog still clung to the trees like memory. I left before sunrise. The cabin dark behind me, locked twice. I didn't tell Mark or Chelsea I was going. Some instincts, once sharpened by years in the emergency room, never fade. You move before the danger has a name. Downtown Asheville was waking up when I parked near Lexington Avenue. The air smelled of roasted coffee and rain. I carried my folder close to my chest. Deeds. Receipts. Bank statements, all the bones of my quiet life packed into a manila shell. Pauline Beck's name had come from a church acquaintance. She used to work for a law firm that handled estates. They'd said, sharp as a tack, even in retirement. I found her in a small office above a bookstore, walls lined with file boxes and the scent of lemon polish. "You're Eleanor Vance," she said, rising with a smile. "I remember your name from the hospital board." "That was a long time ago," I said. "Good years tend to stay visible," she replied, motioning for me to sit. "Tell me what brings you here." I hesitated, unsure how to put betrayal into plain English. Finally, I opened the folder and slid the first page toward her. "My son brought me this," I said. "He said it was for convenience." "I think it was something else." She adjusted her glasses and read the form carefully, her expression hardening as she scanned the fine print. "This isn't convenience," she murmured. "It's transfer by temporary proxy. If you'd signed, your son or whoever filled this out could have acted on your behalf regarding property matters. So they could have sold the house or borrowed against it," she said quietly. "Legally, it's the same outcome." The room felt smaller suddenly. The sound of traffic from the street below came faint through the window. "I want to make sure they can't touch it," I said. Pauline leaned back, thoughtful. "First, we'll record a new deed at the county office confirming sole ownership in your name. Then we'll add a non-transferable clause requiring notarized consent for any change. You'll also update your passwords and financial authorizations. No shared access. No automatic forwarding." She began making notes with a fountain pen, her handwriting precise. "Do you have an estate plan? I never thought I needed one." "You do now," she said gently. "We'll keep it simple. A will, a power of attorney that activates only upon verified medical incapacity, and a trusted witness outside your family. Everything traceable. Everything sealed." It took the rest of the morning signatures, photocopies, 2 trips down the hall to the notary's desk. Pauline's calm steadiness anchored me. She never dramatized, never judged. When we finally paused for lunch, she ordered soup and half a sandwich for both of us, as if she'd known I'd forgotten to eat. "I've seen this kind of thing before," she said over her tea. "When families panic, they reach for what looks steady. Sometimes that's a person. Sometimes it's their house. I spent 42 years saving for that cabin," I said quietly. "Every night shift, every holiday missed, then protect it like a life," she said simply. By late afternoon, we'd finished. She placed the stamped documents in a waterproof envelope and handed it to me like a prescription. "Keep these safe. 1 copy in a bank deposit box, 1 at home, and 1 here with me. And Eleanor, don't let guilt rewrite common sense." Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds thinned to light as I stepped onto the street, the envelope heavy in my purse. For the first time since the mountain phone call, I felt something close to control, not comfort, but readiness, the kind that begins quietly, with ink and resolve. By the time I returned to the cabin, spring had loosened winter's grip. The snow melted into thin streams that laced the slope behind the porch, and the forest exhaled its damp green scent again. Pauline's words still echoed in my head, protect it like a life. So I did. I started with the small things, the kind that looked like ordinary maintenance. I replaced the porch bulb with a motion light and wired 2 more around the back. At night, when the wind shifted, they flickered against the trees like the flash of animal eyes. Next came the garden. I spread cinnamon, peppermint oil, and vinegar along the path, a mix strong enough to chase away deer, raccoons, and, if I was lucky, any guest with perfume thicker than good sense. The smell was sharp, strange, and clean. It wasn't malice guiding me. It was instinct, the same instinct that once told me when a patient's fever was about to spike, when a pulse was fading, when someone's hand needed holding. You can't always fight chaos head-on. Sometimes you redirect it. On my next trip into town, I stopped at the hardware store again. Tom, the owner, looked up from behind the counter. Back already? Vance stocking up, I said lightly, setting down a small list, motion sensors, spare batteries, rope, and a box of solar path lights. He rang them up. Curious, but polite. Planning a project. Something like that. I smiled. Just trying to make sure my guests feel watched over. He laughed, not catching the edge beneath the words, and carried the items to my car. At home, I began building the illusion. I hung old wind chimes near the eaves, thin tubes that caught even the faintest breeze. When they moved, they made a sound halfway between a whisper and a warning. I installed a small outdoor speaker hidden under the porch steps and downloaded an app that played recordings of wildlife at night owls, coyotes, and sometimes the rustle of footsteps on gravel. I'd play them on a timer, unpredictable, just enough to unsettle anyone who thought the woods were theirs to tame. Inside, I organized everything. Locks double-checked. Keys labeled and hidden. Important documents sealed in a plastic folder under the floorboard of my bedroom closet. Pauline would have been proud. I worked slowly, methodically, the way I used to prepare an operating table. Every motion was precise. Every piece had a purpose. The work steadied me. Each evening, I sat on the porch with a mug of tea and watched the lights flicker one by one. The cabin no longer felt like a vulnerable place waiting to be invaded. It felt alive again, watchful, aware, almost protective. Still, there were moments when my resolve faltered. One night, as I was refilling the oil lamps, I found myself staring at the framed photograph of Mark as a child. He was 5 years old in that picture, standing in front of our old house in Raleigh, grinning with his front teeth missing. His hand was in mine. I remembered the way he used to reach for me during storms, the way he'd cry if I worked a double shift and came home after dawn. Somewhere between that small boy and the man who tried to trick me into signing my home away, something had gone terribly wrong. I placed the photograph face down on the mantel. It wasn't anger anymore, it was a quiet sort of grief, the kind that no apology could touch. The next day, I tested everything. Lights on, sensors active, chimes swaying. The cabin hummed softly like a living thing. I added one final touch, a sign at the end of the driveway, carved by hand and nailed to a cedar post. It read, "Private property. Be kind to the wildlife. No threats. No fences. No warnings beyond that." Anyone who truly belonged would understand it as it was meant. As dusk fell, I turned on the porch light and listened to the forest settle. The smell of cedar and peppermint rose from the ground, sharp and clean. The wind chimes trembled like a breath held too long. For the first time in months, I didn't feel afraid of what was coming. Whatever they thought they were walking into, they'd find something waiting, something quiet, clever, and patient. Patience can look like surrender, but it isn't. It's preparation wearing calm like armor. They arrived just as the sun began to slide behind the ridge. The sky bruised purple and gold. I had known they would come late. People like Chelsea's parents never arrived early to anything. They preferred an entrance, not an introduction. The sound of car tires grinding against gravel carried through the trees, followed by doors slamming and voices cutting through the calm. I stood on the porch, one hand on the railing, watching the headlights swing wide across the yard before going dark. Mark was the first to appear, his shoulders hunched, his smile thin. "Mom," he said, forcing cheer. "Hope it's not too much trouble." Behind him, Chelsea stepped out, heels sinking into the soft dirt. "You didn't clear the path," she said, brushing her coat. "It's a little uneven. It's a mountain," I replied simply. Then came her parents, Harold and Susan Trask. I'd met them once, years ago, at the wedding. They hadn't changed much. Harold still had the rigid posture of a man who thought respect was owed to him by default. And Susan wore pearls too white for the woods. Susan sniffed the air. "It smells strange out here," she said. "Peppermint and vinegar." I told her. "Keeps the raccoons away." She frowned, as though I'd confessed to living among savages. "Charming place," Harold added, glancing toward the porch light flickering in the dusk. Though perhaps a little rustic. "It's home," I said. I helped them carry in their bags, each one heavier than necessary. Susan's luggage looked like it could outfit a small expedition. Chelsea trailed behind me, her perfume cutting through the clean scent of cedar. Inside, the cabin glowed warmly lamps-lit, tea ready on the table, fresh linens folded in the guest room. I had gone out of my way to prepare everything. Hospitality, I had learned, is best served without emotion. It unsettles the ungrateful far more than anger ever could. Harold peered at the old stone fireplace. No central heating. "Wood heat's more reliable up here," I said, handing him a mug of tea. "The mountains have their own schedule." He didn't drink it. Chelsea set her phone on the counter. "We'll need better service," she said. "Dad's expecting some calls this week. Reception's better near the porch," I said. "Or if you walk a little up the ridge, just watch your footing. We get coyotes sometimes." Susan froze mid-sip. "Coyotes only at night," I added. "They don't bother anyone who stays inside." That seemed to quiet them. As dusk deepened, the forest began its evening chorus. The wind chimes whispered under the eaves, and the motion light blinked once. Then again, catching Harold off guard. He squinted toward the yard. "Something moved out there. Deer," I said. "Or maybe the light's just getting used to you." Chelsea forced a laugh. "See, Dad, you wanted an adventure." They sat down to eat, though mostly they pushed food around their plates. I had roasted chicken with rosemary, the kind of meal that smelled of comfort. Still, the air felt taut, like a string pulled too tight. Every creak of the house made Susan glance up. Harold kept his phone beside his plate. As if civilization could be summoned through a signal, Mark barely met my eyes. I saw the tension in his jaw, the unease beneath his politeness. Guilt has a scent of its own. It lingers in a room like smoke. After dinner, they retired early, complaining about the country silence. I heard their footsteps upstairs, the shifting of luggage, the nervous laughter. Then the first real test began. At 9, the wind picked up, rattling the chimes until they sang like a warning. The motion light flashed on, then off, as if something large moved near the porch. From the guest room came a muffled shriek, Susan's voice. "Harold, did you hear that I stirred the fire and said nothing?" The wildlife speaker under the steps played a faint rustle, then the long, distant howl of a coyote. Chelsea appeared at the top of the stairs in her robe, eyes wide. "Is someone outside?" "Only the forest," I said, "It has a way of saying goodnight." She didn't find it funny. By 10, the house had gone quiet again. I sat alone by the fire, listening to the chimes hum against the night air. For the first time since this began, I felt no anger, only calm. The mountains didn't need my defense. They had their own ways of teaching manners to those who mistook silence for weakness. And I was learning to listen right along with them. The night came down heavy and restless, the way it does before a storm. The forest outside seemed to shift with each breath of wind, the trees whispering in low, uncertain voices. From the porch, I could hear the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. Inside, the cabin glowed with steady lamplight. I sat near the hearth, tea cooling beside me, a book open on my lap, though I wasn't really reading. Upstairs, the Trasks had retired early, but their footsteps hadn't stopped. The sound of pacing moved back and forth like restless ghosts learning new walls. At 9:30, the first sound came, a hollow thump from the porch. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send Susan's voice echoing down the stairs. "Eleanor, what was that wind?" I called back. "It knocks sometimes." I knew exactly what it was, the motion light testing its new sensitivity. It flared to life, washing the porch in a pale glow before fading again. Then, just as quickly, the second sound followed, a low growl from the speaker beneath the steps. The recorded coyote call drifting into the night air. Susan screamed, and Harold's voice cut through after her. "That's not the wind. There's something out there." I took my time standing up. "There's always something out there," I said, setting my teacup down. By the time I opened the door, the light had gone dark again. The air was cool and still, the smell of mint and damp pine strong enough to make the eyes water. I leaned against the frame and looked out into the yard. Nothing moved, just the forest breathing. Behind me, Chelsea appeared in her robe again, her hair pulled into a nervous knot. "Maybe we should call someone," she said. "It could be a wild animal." "It could," I said softly, "but that's what the woods are for. They were here first." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She stood there a moment longer, glancing into the darkness as though the trees might answer her. Then she turned away, muttering something about the city and safety. The hours stretched long. Every creak of the wood, every tap of a branch against the roof sent a tremor upstairs. At one point, Harold came down, red-faced and furious, clutching his phone like a weapon. "No service," he snapped. "This place is a dead zone." "Yes," I said, stirring the fire. "That's what I like about it." Susan hovered behind him, pale and shaking. We heard footsteps. She whispered. Something was right outside our window. I looked up from the fire. "That window faces the slope," I said. "Could have been a deer." "Deer don't breathe like that," she said. I didn't answer. Some truths are better left unanswered when fear's already done the work for you. Mark came down not long after, his face drawn and tired. "Mom," he said quietly, "this is getting out of hand." "What's getting out of hand?" I asked. "This," he said, gesturing around the cabin. "The lights, the noises. You live out here by yourself. You can't expect anyone to feel safe." "I feel safe," I said. He looked at me, searching for something in my face that I no longer carried the mother who always folded first, the one who forgave before the truth surfaced. But she was gone now, and the silence between us was colder than the wind outside. At midnight, the forest began to sing again. The wind chimes stirred, setting off a faint, metallic melody that threaded through the dark. A crash echoed from the guest room, a picture frame. I guessed, and Susan screamed once more. Chelsea appeared on the stairs, clutching a blanket. "This place isn't normal," she said. "You should have warned us." "I did." I said, "You just didn't listen." Harold stormed toward the door, muttering about driving back to the city. When he opened it, the motion light flared again, flooding his face in white. He froze for a heartbeat, then slammed the door shut. "Something's moving out there," he barked. "Probably the wind," I said again. "It has a mind of its own up here." They gathered in the living room like passengers on a sinking ship, eyes darting. Voices low, the air thick with nervous energy. I refilled my tea, the sound of the kettle hissing calm and steady. No one spoke after that. Even the chimes quieted, as if the mountain itself had settled to watch. By dawn, the guests had fallen into uneasy sleep on the couches. The fire burned low to embers. I sat beside it, wrapped in Ray's old flannel, the scent of wood smoke and mint clinging to me. Outside, the light shifted pale over the ridge, and the first birds began to call. The house was still, the air fragile as glass. I hadn't slept a minute, but I felt rested in a way I hadn't in years. The forest had done what I could not. It had spoken in its own language. Clear and final, some lessons, I thought, can only be learned in the dark. The morning came pale and thin, light spilling through the windows like a reluctant guest. The house smelled of cold ashes and nerves. I had brewed coffee before anyone stirred, moving quietly, my steps soft on the wood floor. The storm of the night had passed, but its echo lingered in the walls. I heard them before I saw them, whispers. Hurried steps, the zipper of a suitcase biting the air. When I turned the corner, Susan stood by the door, already dressed, pearls back in place, hair brushed to precision. Her husband hovered near the staircase, clutching his phone like a lifeline. "Leaving so soon?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Susan flinched, then forced a smile. "We didn't want to trouble you further, dear. It's just, well, the mountain air doesn't agree with me." "The air," Harold repeated, rubbing his temple. "And the noises. We hardly slept a wink. Something about this place." He let the sentence fade, eyes darting toward the window as if the forest might overhear. Chelsea appeared next, face pale, her usual sharpness dimmed. "They're going to stay at our condo in Charlotte for a bit," she said, "just until they feel settled again." I poured coffee for everyone, setting the mugs on the counter. "That sounds wise," I said. "The city suits them. It's quieter in its own way." No one laughed. Mark came down last, hair disheveled, jaw tight. "I'll drive them," he said, grabbing his keys. His tone was brisk, businesslike, as though efficiency could erase the humiliation of the night before. "You don't have to," I said softly. "There's a bus at 10. They can take that." He looked at me for a long moment, the way someone looks when they can't decide if you're being kind or cruel. Then he nodded. "Maybe that's best." Susan opened her mouth to protest, then seemed to think better of it. She gathered her things, her perfume trailing behind her like a defense. When she finally stepped onto the porch, she glanced back once, eyes wide, as if afraid to meet mine too long. "The house has character," she said, voice trembling. "Just not the kind we're used to." I smiled politely. "The mountain gives back what you bring to it." Her husband muttered something under his breath, but I didn't ask him to repeat it. The screen door shut behind them, and soon the sound of their footsteps faded down the path toward the road. The silence that followed was deeper than any I'd known it had weight, but also space to breathe. Chelsea lingered behind, twisting her hands together. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I didn't think it would be so hard for them." "They'll be fine," I said. "Some places simply tell the truth faster than others." She blinked, not understanding. Or perhaps she did. She hugged me stiffly and followed Mark out. When the car started, its engine roared against the calm like a protest. Gravel kicked up behind the tires. And then they were gone, swallowed by the curve of the road and the green hush of the trees. I stood on the porch for a while, letting the wind brush through my hair. The light was soft now, the world reset. I could still see the faint outline of their footprints in the damp earth impressions already fading. For the first time in weeks, I walked back inside and left the door unlocked. The air felt clean again, the kind of quiet that wasn't waiting to be broken. Peace, I thought, is never permanent. But sometimes it returns when the wrong people finally decide to leave. The morning after they left, the cabin felt too still. No footsteps overhead, no perfume thickening the air, only the faint sound of rain slipping down the gutters and the kettle beginning to whistle. I thought peace had returned. I was wrong. I spent the morning cleaning habit more than necessity. I stripped the guest beds, gathered towels, and opened the windows to let the forest breathe back in. The air was sharp with the scent of wet pine and the faint trace of vinegar I'd used on the floors. Everything felt lighter. But when I turned toward the small writing desk in the corner of the guest room, something caught my eye, a manila folder, thick, resting half under a folded sweater. It hadn't been there before. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Years in the hospital had trained me to notice the quiet wrongness in a room, the extra pill bottle, the misplaced chart. This had that same weight. I sat down, pulled the folder free, and opened it. Inside were several pages, neatly clipped together. The first bore the county seal. My name appeared in clean black print across the top, just beneath the words, Property Transfer Authorization. It took me a moment to understand what I was reading. Then the shape of it struck like ice through my chest. The document stated that I, Eleanor M. Vance, granted my son, Mark R. Vance, full power to act on my behalf regarding the deed to my cabin, including authority to sell, lease, or restructure ownership. My signature was there, written in the same steady cursive I'd used all my life. Only it wasn't mine. It was practiced, familiar, but off by the smallest measure, the loop of the E too tight, the V less deliberate. Someone had traced me, like a shadow wearing my name. I turned the pages. Bank authorizations. A notarization stamp dated 2 weeks ago. Even a copy of my driver's license photocopied, blurred at the edges. Every piece of it told the same lie that I had given permission to be erased. My hands began to tremble. I set the folder down carefully, afraid that if I tore it, it might stop being real. Mark's voice echoed faintly in my mind, his careful, gentle tone when he'd said, "You're being suspicious for no reason." He had come into my home, smiled across my table, handed me a decoy form to distract me while another waited in his pocket. The anger rose slow and cold, the kind that doesn't shout, it calcifies. I carried the folder to the kitchen counter and spread the pages out under the light. Each signature stared back at me. A performance of trust turned weapon. Betrayal, I realized, has a temperature it burns, but not hot. It freezes everything it touches. For a long time, I didn't move. Then I reached for the phone. Pauline answered on the second ring. Her voice calm as always. "Eleanor, I found something," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. "In the guest room. It's worse than I thought." "Describe it," she said quickly. I told her about the papers, the forged signature, the dates. There was a pause long enough for me to hear her breath catch softly on the line. "Don't destroy anything," she said firmly. "Keep them exactly as you found them. I'll drive up tomorrow. We'll photograph every page and file a report for document fraud." "Will that stop him?" I asked. "It will slow him," she said, "and it will protect you." After we hung up, I made another pot of tea but never drank it. I just sat there, listening to the rain on the porch roof and the faint crackle of the fire. The betrayal hurt most, not because it was clever, but because it was familiar. My son knew exactly how I thought, how I organized, how I signed my name, how I believed in family even when it cost me sleep. He had built his lie from the details only love could have given him. By evening, the rain had stopped, and the forest glistened with fresh color. I gathered the folder, sealed it inside a clear plastic sleeve, and placed it in the drawer beneath my tea towels safe. For now. Then I locked the door, checked each window latch, and turned off the porch light. Trust, I thought, should never have to be defended, but sometimes it does. And when it does, defense begins with silence, steady hands, and proof waiting on a counter. 2 days passed before I saw the car again. It appeared in the driveway just after noon, its tires crunching over the gravel, with none of the confidence they'd had before. I watched from the porch, tea cooling beside me, as Chelsea stepped out alone. No mark this time. Her hands shook as she closed the car door, and she stood there for a long moment, staring at the cabin as if it were a place she wasn't sure she was allowed to enter. When she finally climbed the steps, her voice was soft. "Eleanor." "May I come in?" I nodded, pushing the screen door open. She smelled faintly of perfume and panic. Her hair, usually polished into perfect curls, hung limp around her face. Inside, she didn't sit right away. Her eyes darted to the table where the folder still rested under a heavy cookbook. She must have seen the corner of the manila edge, because her throat worked like she'd swallowed something sharp. "You found it," she said quietly. "I did." Her fingers twisted together until her knuckles went white. "He wasn't supposed to leave it here," she whispered. "He said he had everything under control." I poured her tea, the same kind I'd offered the first night they arrived. She wrapped her hands around the cup, though she didn't drink. "What did he do?" "Chelsea," I asked. She looked up then, her eyes glassy. "He forged it, all of it. The signature, the notary stamp, everything." Her voice cracked. "He said he'd fix it before you ever knew, that it was just temporary. Temporary for the debt." She said he lost more than $100,000 at a private table in Charlotte. The bank was already calling. And the investors. She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth. "He told me he'd pay them back once he refinanced your property. He said you'd never notice." I sat down across from her. The quiet between us was heavy, but not cruel. I could see she'd rehearsed this maybe in the car, maybe in her mind for nights before coming here. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. She blinked hard. "Because I can't lie for him anymore. Not about this." She looked down at the tea, her reflection rippling in it. "He keeps saying it's just money, but it isn't. Is it? It's everything. It's your peace." And I helped him take it. Her confession landed softly, but sank deep. For the first time, I saw her not as the polished woman who'd looked down at my life in the woods, but as someone trapped in her own wreckage. "Did he tell you I'd already found a lawyer?" I asked. She shook her head. "He'll panic when he finds out. He thinks you're still naive." "I was," I said, "but not anymore." She looked up, startled by the calm in my voice. "I'll help you, if you'll let me," she said. "I kept copies of his emails, the ones to the investors. They mention your property by name. I can get them to your lawyer." I studied her for a moment. "You're not doing this for me," I said gently. "You're doing it because you know he's already lost." Her chin trembled. Maybe both things can be true. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing the porch chimes into motion. The sound filled the small kitchen, soft and eerie. Chelsea took a shaky sip of her tea and winced. "It's stronger than I remember. Some things are," I said. She set the cup down and stood. "I'll send the emails tonight." When she left, I watched her car wind down the road until it disappeared behind the trees. The air smelled of wet earth and pine again, the kind of smell that lingers after rain has washed something clean. I wasn't ready to forgive her, but for the first time, I believed her, and maybe that was the beginning of something, if not peace. Then at least the truth finding its way home. Pauline arrived the next morning just as the mist was lifting off the trees. She stepped out of her car carrying a leather briefcase and the calm of someone who had seen storms come and go. I met her on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, both steaming. I brought my camera, a scanner, and about 20 years of stubbornness. She said with a half smile, "Let's get to work, inside." I laid everything out on the kitchen table, the forged documents, the notes from Chelsea's confession, even the printout of the county records that proved my ownership. Pauline worked methodically, photographing each page, labeling evidence with quiet precision. "Did she tell you why he did it?" she asked without looking up. "Gambling." I said, "More than $100,000. He used my name as collateral." Pauline's pen paused midair. "That explains the rush. And the arrogance." She sighed softly. "He's desperate." "Eleanor, desperate people are unpredictable." "I know," I said. "That's why I don't want to wait for him to make the next move." We spent the rest of the morning gathering every thread of proof. Chelsea had emailed the promised files overnight, copies of Mark's correspondence, with 2 men listed only by initials. Their tone was casual, but the meaning clear. Mark intended to leverage existing property assets in Bryson to cover his private losses. My cabin had become a bargaining chip in a game I never agreed to play. Pauline read them carefully, her expression darkening. "This is enough for fraud investigation," she said. "But we'll do better than that. We'll go on offense." She drafted a notarized affidavit detailing the forgery, attaching Chelsea's signed statement as corroboration. We added the time-stamped photos, my recorded phone log, and the copies of Mark's emails. By afternoon, the case was taking shape not as revenge, but as a wall of paper between me and the chaos he'd tried to bring into my life. At one point, Pauline looked up from her notes. "You're remarkably calm," she said. "Most people shake through this. I spent 4 decades in emergency rooms." I replied, "Calm is the only thing that keeps you standing." She smiled faintly. "Then you'll do fine in court." We drove into town together before sunset to file the first set of documents at the county clerk's office. The building smelled of dust and old wood. And the clerk, a woman about my age with reading glasses dangling from a chain, looked up with sympathy when she saw the paperwork. "Family?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said. "Unfortunately." She stamped each page with deliberate care. The sound of it, each heavy thud of ink meeting paper, felt like a heartbeat slowing into rhythm. When we left, the air had cooled, and the street lights flickered on one by one. Pauline handed me a sealed envelope. "Your copy," she said. "Keep it locked away. From here on, any move he makes goes through your attorney. No more phone calls. No more emotional appeals." "I understand," I said. Before getting into her car, she turned back. "You did the right thing, Eleanor. You didn't shout. You didn't threaten. You documented. That's how people like him lose. They expect noise, not precision." I stood there a long while after she left, the envelope tucked under my arm. The town was quiet, except for the sound of a train passing somewhere in the distance. Back at the cabin, I locked the papers in the metal box under the bed and sat by the fire. The flames moved low and steady, their glow catching the edges of the manila folder that had started it all. I thought of Mark then not as my son, not as the boy with scraped knees, but as a man cornered by his own lies. Somewhere, he was probably still trying to stay ahead of the truth. He didn't know it yet, but the truth had already caught up. It happened on a Thursday morning, gray and windless, the kind of day that makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. I was trimming the hydrangeas when a white sedan pulled into the drive. The car door opened, and a woman stepped out, a stranger, mid-40s, neat brown coat, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Vance," she called, her tone practiced and careful. Yes, I said, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves. My name is Dana McMillan. I'm a social services representative with the county's Adult Protection Division. We received a call expressing concern about your well-being. I felt the air thin for a moment, though I kept my voice even. Concern, I repeated. From whom I'm not at liberty to disclose that, she said, but I'm required to follow up. Would you mind if I came inside? Of course, I said, holding the door open. I just made coffee. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the yard at the neat porch steps. The clean siding, the solar lights lining the walk, then back to me. That's very kind, ma'am. Inside. She took in the space like someone cataloging evidence. Her gaze moved from the bookshelf to the desk to the framed photo of Ray, pausing at each detail. You live alone? Yes, I said, and I manage just fine. I'm sure you do, she replied softly, taking a seat at the kitchen table. But the report we received suggested possible cognitive decline, mention of confusion about finances, difficulty maintaining the property, and isolation. I almost smiled. It was all too predictable. Without a word, I crossed to the cabinet and retrieved a thick binder and a small hard drive from the drawer. I set them gently on the table. Would you like to see my confusion? She blinked, a little startled. I beg your pardon. I opened the binder. Each page was labeled in my careful handwriting bank statements, receipts, utility records, property taxes paid 6 months early. Even the notarized deed Pauline and I had filed last week. I keep everything in order. My attorney has digital backups of these as well. Then I opened my laptop and played the short video I'd saved, the dated recording of Mark and Chelsea arriving at the cabin, followed by the police dashcam clip from their last visit to the courthouse. Time-stamped, documented. I said quietly, the truth doesn't need to argue. It just needs to exist. Dana sat back in her chair. You seem very organized, she said finally. Would you mind if I take a few notes? Not at all, I said, pouring her coffee. She asked questions, and I answered everyone how I managed my medications, how often I spoke with neighbors, how I handled emergencies. I told her about Tom from the hardware store who checked in weekly, about the small circle of women from church who called on Sundays. Each detail painted the life I actually lived: quiet, capable, not lonely but selective. When she finished her notes, she smiled, genuine this time. Mrs. Vance, I can assure you there's no cause for concern. I'll be submitting a report clearing you of all allegations. I suspected as much, I said softly. She hesitated at the door. Whoever made that call, it was deliberate. You know that. Don't you? I do, I said, but I also know that false stories have short legs. Dana nodded once, as if she understood more than her job required. You take care, Mrs. Vance. You seem to have things well in hand. When her car disappeared down the road, I returned to my pruning. The sky was still gray, but the air had shifted. It carried a note of calm, the kind that follows after a storm when everything false has finally run out of breath. It was close to midnight when I heard it, the slow crunch of gravel beneath cautious feet. The fire had burned low, painting the walls in amber light, and the sound came sharp through the quiet like a warning I'd been expecting. I set my cup down and listened. One step, then another. The porch boards creaked, and the motion light above the door flared white against the dark. Someone was out there. I didn't move right away. After everything, fear had become an old companion, predictable, almost manageable. I reached for the small flashlight in the drawer and stepped softly to the window. The beam of the light cut through the mist. Catching a shape near the woodpile, a man stood there, hunched. His jacket soaked from the rain. He wasn't Mark. He was taller, older, with a rough beard and the kind of eyes that had forgotten sleep. Ma'am, he called. his voice low but clear. "I need to talk to you. About your son." My hand stayed on the latch. "Who are you?" He hesitated, glancing toward the motion light that had begun to flicker again. "Name's Daniel Reed. I worked with Mark. He owes me money, a lot of it. I just need to know if he's here." "He isn't," I said. "And you should leave." He took a step closer, palms out, not threatening but desperate. "He told me you'd cover his debt if things went bad. Said you had property worth more than $200,000. He said I know what he said." I interrupted. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass. He saw it then, the calm that comes when panic has burned itself out. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't that. Wasn't. I moved to the side table, pressed the small emergency fob I'd kept beside the phone since Ray's illness. The sheriff's office had given it to me years ago. A relic from my hospital days. It still worked. Daniel stepped back as the motion light flicked on again, washing him in white. A car turned onto the road below, blue lights reflecting faintly through the trees. He swore under his breath and stumbled toward the woods just as the police cruiser rolled into the drive. 2 deputies stepped out, hands steady, flashlights sweeping the yard. "Everything all right?" "Mrs. Vance," one asked. "Yes," I said. "He's gone now." They searched briefly, found nothing but footprints in the wet earth. When they left, the road fell silent again, save for the whisper of wind through the trees. I locked the door, stoked the fire, and sat back down. My hands were steady. The forest outside watched with me, quiet and knowing. For the first time in months, I realized I wasn't afraid of what came knocking. I was simply waiting for the next sound and ready when it came. The courthouse in Asheville was quiet that morning. The kind of quiet that hums beneath polished floors and old wood. I sat at the end of the long bench, hands folded around a small envelope of documents Pauline had helped me prepare. The room smelled faintly of paper and lemon oil, a place built for truth even when it came late. Mark arrived just before the session began. He looked smaller somehow. The confidence drained from his shoulders. Chelsea followed behind him, her face pale, her steps careful. She didn't look at me, but she didn't have to. Her presence there was enough. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The sound of chairs scraping across the floor echoed like thunder. Then came the ritual of procedure titles, oaths, names read into the record. Read. When they said mine, I answered softly, steady as a heartbeat. Pauline sat beside me, her notes in order, her expression calm. She'd been through hundreds of cases. But this one, I could tell, carried weight for her too. The opposing attorney began with formality, his voice smooth and tired. "My client acknowledges financial distress," he said. "However, intent to defraud his mother cannot be proven beyond assumption." Pauline rose, her tone measured. "We have evidence to the contrary." She handed the judge the folder, the one that had lived in my kitchen drawer, its edges worn from too many sleepless nights. Inside were the forged documents, copies of the emails, and Chelsea's signed statement. Chelsea took the stand next. Her hands trembled as she swore to tell the truth. When she spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper. She told them about the gambling, the debt, the lie he'd built in my name. She cried once quietly, but never asked for pity. Mark stared at the table, his face unreadable. When it was his turn, he spoke only once. "I was trying to fix it before she found out." He said. The judge's gavel came down with a sound that seemed to stop the air. "Mr. Vance," he said, "the law does not excuse betrayal with good intentions. Restitution is ordered. Contact is forbidden." It was done. When I walked out of the courtroom, the light outside was soft, filtered through spring rain. Pauline touched my arm gently. "It's over," she said. No, I replied. It's protected. The cabin, my home, was now secured under a legal trust untouchable, steady as the mountain itself, and for the first time, justice didn't roar. It simply stood, quiet and unshakable. Summer came slowly to the mountains, stretching daylight into long gold hours that softened even the sharp edges of memory. By then, months had passed since the court hearing. The papers were sealed, the cabin secured under its trust, and the silence I'd once guarded now felt like something earned rather than stolen. One afternoon in June, I saw a familiar car pull into the gravel path below the mailbox. Chelsea stepped out, dressed plainly, her hair tied back. In the passenger seat, a little girl leaned forward, her eyes wide at the sight of the trees that seemed to swallow the sky. I hadn't seen her before, but I knew immediately Mark's daughter, my granddaughter. Chelsea waved uncertainly, then guided the child up the path. "This is Nora," she said when they reached the porch. "She wanted to meet you." Nora hid behind her mother's leg, peeking out shyly. "Grandma," she whispered. Testing the word, I knelt to her height and smiled. "That's me." Chelsea's eyes shone with exhaustion, but not pride. "We've moved back," she said. "Just a few miles from here. I got a part-time job at the clinic in town. They needed someone with nursing experience. And I remembered what you told me about steady work being better than easy money." Her voice faltered, then steadied again. "I thought you might like to know." I nodded, motioning them inside. The house smelled of lemon polish and the faint sweetness of drying herbs from the windowsill. I poured iced tea for her, apple juice for the little one, and listened while she spoke about the new apartment, the long hours, the peace she was trying to rebuild. "I'm not asking for anything," she said finally. "I just wanted you to know we're all right, and that I'm sorry for all of it." I watched Nora tracing the pattern of the tablecloth with one finger, humming softly to herself. "Forgiveness," I realized, "wasn't a word you said, it was a space you left open. In case someone found their way back. Would you like to help me water the garden?" I asked the child. Her face lit up. "Can I?" "Of course, outside." The sun poured over the yard, catching the motion lights I'd forgotten to turn off. The three of us stood by the rose bushes, their blooms heavy and bright. Nora laughed when the hose splashed her shoes, and Chelsea laughed too. A sound that carried something lighter than I'd ever heard in her voice. When they left that evening, she hugged me not long, not certain, but real. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not turning us away." After the car disappeared around the bend, I walked back to the porch. The house waited, unchanged, the air warm with late light. I sat in Ray's old chair and listened to the forest settling in for the night. Peace, I thought, wasn't about forgetting. It was about what you choose to keep the quiet, the boundaries, and the chance, however small, for something kind to grow again. By Christmas Eve, the mountains were white again. Snow had drifted softly through the night, wrapping the porch rails and steps in a quiet shimmer. The world looked untouched, the kind of stillness that only winter knows. I spent the evening as I always did, roasting a small chicken, setting 2 plates out of habit, though one stayed empty. The fire crackled low, the smell of pine and rosemary filling the cabin. Outside, the forest stood hushed, its branches heavy under the weight of snow. When the clock chimed 8, I put on Ray's old cardigan and stepped out to the porch. The cold bit at my cheeks, but the air was clean, sharp, alive. I brushed the snow from the light switch beside the door and paused, my hand hovering there. That porch light had been his doing, wired with care the first spring we built this place. For years, I'd kept it on as a beacon, a small glow for whoever might find their way home. For Mark, for the family I'd lost and learned to love from a distance, for the woman I used to be. Now, as the snow fell in slow, steady flakes, I finally understood. Some lights aren't meant to guide anyone back, they're meant to remind you that you stayed. I flipped the switch. The bulb flickered once, then shone warm against the snow. This light isn't for waiting anymore, I whispered. It's for peace. The wind carried my words into the trees, where they vanished like breath. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the quiet hum of the lamp, the heartbeat of the house. Then I went inside, leaving the light on steady, gentle, and enough